Hey everyone, welcome to the 377th episode of the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and your co-host,
Kevin Toffel.
And we have a lot to talk about this week. We've got a lot of reports, starting with the Ericsson Mobility Report and the NPR Smart Audio Report. We also have reports about Chinese authorities and some surveillance stuff we're not excited about. Microsoft is going to scrap some of its facial recognition. We're going to talk about why that matters. We've got new products from Phillips Hue. We've got a new type of electricity generating ink for IoT, or potentially for IoT. We've got new microcontrollers, and we've got an update on Google's plans to update its devices for the upcoming Matter protocol. We're also going to hear from our sponsor, Nordic Semiconductor. And our guest this week is Daniel Dos Santos, who is head of security research at Vidir Labs, which is part of Forescout. We're going to be talking about those 56 OT vulnerabilities that Forescout announced this week. You actually might be a little bit surprised about why there are so many. But first, let's get a message from another one of our sponsors. This week's sponsor is Wirepass, which is on a mission to set a new standard in IoT. Wirepass believes in infinitely scalable connectivity software that never fails, and they concentrate on large industrial applications. Wirepass thinks this sort of connectivity should be affordable. That is their mission. Wirepass is the future of enterprise IoT, and with the recent 5G standard update, they've got a chance to change the IoT in a non-cellular way. You can learn more about Wirepass at wirepass.com. That's WIREPAS.com. All right, we're going to start the show off with Ericsson's mobility report, and they are guesstimating, I don't know, how many connections coming up?
1 billion with a B, 5G connections or subscriptions by the end of this year. And 5 years from now, they say 4.4 billion.
Which is still way off from the trillions of devices we hoped we would have by 2025. But that's okay. It's still a lot. And to be fair, this is only cellular. Ericsson makes cellular equipment, radios, servers, software, all kinds of stuff for building out cellular networks. So they have a vested interest in cellular connectivity. So no LoRaWAN, no Wi-Fi. It's all about the Gs.
Yep.
The 4, the 5. So in this report, IoT is an important part of 5G, but it's not like the main part, which is still broadband, mostly broadband focused for now, and driven a lot by cellular phones. They do note that it's driven right now by mid-tier cellular phones. And 5G is actually being adopted faster than 4G was, which I actually thought was kind of surprising, simply because when 4G launched back in like 2010, we were suffering. We were really suffering. So we had the iPhone by then. We had smartphones that really consumed a lot of data, and we were trying to consume it, and the networks just weren't robust enough. So by the time 4G came around, I felt like we were like, gimme.
We were. And just before the show, we were talking about how long of a transition that took, because I remember testing one of the first 4G dongles for a computer in December of 2010, but it really wasn't, we figure, until September of 2012 with the iPhone 5 that pushed, at least in the US, that pushed 4G adoption mainstream. And we remember, and maybe you guys do too, how bad the networks were equipped to handle all the influx of traffic at that time.
Oh, yeah. The iPhone really did a number on data networks. Woof. Because, again, it made surfing the web on your phone so much easier. Before then, I remember using the web on like my Palm Trio just really lame use cases where...
Yeah. I had devices before the web. So, yeah, I hear you.
Yes, Kevin's been testing devices for decades.
Yes. Although Ericsson focuses on broadband as a whole, and those figures we just talked about earlier were about subscriptions, mobile broadband subscriptions for 5G. They do have an interesting chart in here in their report about cellular IoT connections. And as I look at it, I don't know the exact number, but if I extrapolate, it looks like about 2.4 billion cellular IoT connections this year. which is a lot.
It is.
It's not the trillions that we talked about, but it's a lot.
Yeah. And they break out their IoT numbers and data into the 2G and 3G connections, which are surprisingly still around, even though here in the US, most 3G modems and services like AT&T and Verizon have sunset their 3G.
Right.
But apparently 2G is still around in some places. And actually, next year, the 5G IoT connections driven by NB-IoT, which is a lower data rate, lower power cellular IoT connection, and then Cat-M, which is a lower data rate, but still can give you a respectable 1 megabit to 5 megabits per second download. It's also a low power IoT, kind of an IoT as opposed to a broadband connection. Those two are being adopted, but those two connections, the NB-IoT and Cat-M, won't actually overtake 2G and 3G connections until 2023.
Which is surprising, but then again, we have a US-centric perspective because we've seen and read about all the sunsetting over the last several years of 3G and some 4G stuff, or 2G for sure. I can't remember the last time I used a 2G device, quite honestly.
No. And I should note the report also says that about 30% of all cellular IoT devices are still connecting through those 2G and 3G networks, to which I'm like, what?
Well, and it's kind of, I wouldn't say it's buried in the report, but you got to dig around, with all these graphs and charts. And it looks like regions such as Africa, the lower Middle East, those areas are still heavily reliant upon 2G, 3G from a global standpoint. So that may have something to do with that figure.
And they say in the US and Europe, which is mostly sunset their 3G networks, there are still 2G networks out there. So it is definitely a global thing. So the world is vast, y'all. All right, let's talk about another report. This one is a little bit more fun.
Yes, it is.
This is the Smart Audio report that NPR does with Edison Research. And they basically, it's been around since, I want to say, 2017. So they've been doing this. This is the 5th year. They interview a little over 2,000 people about how they listen to audio. And they've discovered some fun things, and they've discovered things that we already sort of know. But extrapolate that 35% of Americans that are over 18 own a smart speaker. That's about 100 million people. And a little bit more fun is they're proving the idea right that the smart speaker market is pretty saturated. Mm-hmm. We saw from 2017 to 2021 some big increases, some double-digit increases in growth of the smart speaker market. But between 2021 and 2022, we only saw a 9% increase.
It's growing, but the rate of growth is slowing.
Which makes sense. I mean,
I agree.
You're moving if you're starting from a bigger base number, so growth is always harder. What is hilarious is they've adopted the how it started and how it's going meme. And for 2017, the how it started.
Yeah, you read those. I'll read the 2022s.
Excellent. All right. How it started. Top 3 reasons for getting a smart speaker in 2017. 1, listen to music. 2, ask questions without needing to type. 3, seems like a fun new gadget.
All right, buckle up. Here's the top 3 reasons for getting a smart speaker in 2022. 1, listen to music. 2, ask questions without needing to type. 3, seems like a fun new gadget. Wait, that sounds familiar.
I think this really emphasizes the fact that we started off strong with voice, and it's just too complicated. There's too many things to do. It's hard to surface information. We'll talk about how they're trying to address that and how annoying that is for people in a minute. And even things like the smart home, I think it speaks to the fact that the smart home is still really difficult. Although 86% of people do think it makes for a smarter living experience, having that smart or more convenient home experience.
Yeah, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, I love turning on my lights. And 90% of people think that smart speaker interactions are short and easy with a low level of effort. Totally agree. So in another how it started, how it's going section, we have what are kind of the big issues associated with having a smart speaker and how it started. Debates about smart speakers, always listening.
Well, let's see how it's going. Debates about smart speakers, always listening. It's the same challenge.
It is. Now, what we have seen increase, I guess, is people are more worried about hackers getting access to their home or personal information, as opposed to 2017, when people were more worried about the smart speaker allowing the government to listen into their private conversations.
I presume this is this is all US based, right?
Yes, this is all US based.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So in worries about hackers, just worries about people always listening, that is a function of smart speaker use. I mean, that's what they do. Now, in the last 5 years, the amount of time that people spend listening to audio through a smart speaker has increased by 400%, which is pretty awesome. And just for y'all who apparently love podcasts, since you're listening to us, the share of time spent listening to podcasts through a smart speaker is up 200%. Yay!
I think part of that is the fact that people have more speakers, therefore more scenarios or environments where they're sitting around and they can say, hey, so-and-so, play the IoT podcast, It's convenient. It's convenient, no doubt. I just think that having more endpoints to be able to do that is part of what's driving that as well.
Yeah, more endpoints. I think more comfort. The fact that we're all home more often might be a big issue too.
Yeah.
And then this was kind of surprising. Actually, it's not surprising because it ties very closely with how we live with our smart speaker, but it tracked the number of different types of tasks that people ask a smart speaker to do in a typical week. Back in 2017, when it was hitting the mainstream, people asked for 7.5 tasks.
In a week?
In a week. In 2022, they're only asking for 12.4 tasks.
Yeah, it's growth, but you and I must be outliers, because how would you answer that question? How many times or how many different types of tasks on a smart speaker in a typical week do you do? I guess types of tasks is not number of interactions. Maybe I'm confusing it at first here.
It still feels low. I mean, so I guess lights on, weather. I ask the temperature inside. I ask it to preheat my oven. Mm-hmm. What time is it? Play audio. Set a timer. That's 7 right there.
Yeah.
So maybe I will have a hard time getting to 12.
Yeah. Now that I think about it, because it's tasks. So certainly lights. You use voice for multiple lights, but that would just be one task, I would imagine, even if it's different lights.
I set the Ecobee, so I set the thermostat. Right.
I open and close my garage door.
Yeah, I was going to say I tell it to lock the doors. All right. It's a good night routine. I'm now at 9. What else?
I set alarms occasionally.
Oh, set alarms. Good. That's 10.
Right. Yeah, we got to beat 12.4. Come on, we can do it.
I don't know if we can.
Sure. Have you ever played a podcast?
You know what? I asked it if a store was open.
Yeah.
Okay, so I asked about opening and closing the store.
Right. Not directions, but hours. Sure.
Hours. Okay. Oh, I do time zone conversions all the time. So I've hit 12.
Yes, she does.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say.
Oh, in currency conversions, that's 13.
Yes. And we use it once a month to pick the
random
IoT
number
voicemail.
Generator.
We use the random number generator to pick the winner of the IoT voicemail. Yep. Okay. Every month we do that. So it's not really, it's like 0.25 in a week, but yeah. Okay. Because it's types of tasks, different types of tasks. I guess that number is right. At first I thought it was low, but in that context, that makes sense to me. How many more tasks are there going to be? I mean, I don't see a lot more growth here.
Well, they have a whole slide. Look up recipes, order an item.
Yeah.
Oh, add to calendar, add a task. Tell us a joke.
Yeah.
I never asked for a joke.
No. I mean, originally, we might have done that, but not these days.
Get the news. Make a phone call. Order food. Play NPR.
Yeah, I mean, make a phone call. We've used that with Madam A in the past. You and I have tested that.
Okay, but testing I'm doing things that I do in my normal life. Oh, add something to a shopping list. Oh, I ask it to vacuum.
As do I.
All right.
We're above average. That's all. That's all we wanted,
that's to be above average.
Yeah.
Let's see. The rest of this is about podcasts and news. So,
there's one more quick bit just to mention. The smart speaker owners were asked, has your smart speaker ever Offered more information than you requested. 51% said yes. Recommended a feature for your smart speaker without your prompting. 41% said yes. Here's the biggie. Suggested you purchase something without your prompting. 31%. And I think, Stacey, you are probably in that 31%.
Oh my gosh, yes. So chatty. Amazon is the most chatty, I'll be honest. Google has started to get there, though. And Amazon sometimes just drives me nuts. Like sometimes I'll be like, hey, what's the weather? And it's like, it tells me the weather and it's like, by the way, you have a notification. Would you like to hear it? And I'm like, sure. And then it says, you have no notifications. And I'm like, oh,
lovely.
Madam A.
You know who isn't chatty? I'm just going to say it.
Okay, Siri.
Oh, that's right.
This is the section of the show where Kevin tries to convince me to adopt Apple HomeKit.
No. I'm just making a point that's relevant to the report. That's all.
Yeah. And they ask, how much does it bother you when your smart speaker offers you more information? 40% of the people say it doesn't bother you at all. 42% say it bothers you a little. And 18% say it bothers you a lot.
Yeah. Just do what I asked.
Yeah.
That's how I was raised. Mom and Dad said, just do what I asked.
All I want is what I'm asking you to do.
That's right.
So there we go. That is the update on smart speakers. Let's move to the more dystopian society. Today in dystopian news, there are reports. Vice had a report. I'm linking to a Voice of America, which, as y'all may be familiar with, Voice of America is the U.S. government's propaganda. I'll just be honest.
Yes.
It's our propaganda news. But they did say the story is the Chinese government is starting to use the COVID trackers that they implemented to track people and to stop protests. Basically, what's happening is the Chinese government has a color-coded smartphone app that tracks people where they move. We actually have similar things. Ours isn't color-coded, but they would actually turn people's apps red that indicates they can't travel. And they did
even
that.
If they didn't have COVID.
Even if they didn't have COVID. And this means they can't get on trains and they can't do things, buses, et cetera. And they did that to stop them from protesting at a bank that had lost deposits.
Yep.
So this feels like
icky.
Really icky. This is bad.
It's not surprising. It's not surprising at all, considering how surveillance-oriented China is. And I'm not judging. I'm just observing. So it's not surprising to me, but it's disappointing. And of course, outside of China, I mean, I think everybody should be at least keep this in mind that their government could do the same.
And
I mean, obviously the technology is there.
It's disconcerting. And we already see things. The New York Times this week actually had a really big series of articles on using surveillance technology in China, which talks about things we talk about on the show all the time, which is very scary. They have a huge facial recognition program. They have the ability to, they've got cameras set up in more places than we have. And they're linking that back to people's social scores. We don't have social scores in the US or Europe yet. Hopefully we never do. Well, okay, yes, we don't have
that we know
social
of.
Scores. I don't know what's hanging out in the CIA or the FBI. But this is worrisome, and we should look at things like China because it could impact us eventually here in the US. Maybe not in this way, but we're looking at things like people are very concerned about if abortion laws by states, if Roe v. Wade is struck down, people are legitimately concerned that people's healthcare data could be used to track them. So this is a different type of surveillance data. And people are very focused on like period tracking apps. But I would say you should also be focused on things like your Fitbit, for example. There have been documented cases of people's Fitbits tracking changes in heart rate that indicate pregnancy. So if you see like a state like Texas or Oklahoma that is like, hey, we don't allow abortions here, they could ask for information about if someone is pregnant. And with that information, they could make sure that person does not actively, I guess, leave the state or end their pregnancy. So those kinds of things, China is very overt. I think here in the US, we probably would not be as overt, but the possibility is there. And we already are wearing, the difference is private companies as opposed to states have access to some of this information. Speaking of private companies and surveillance, Microsoft has decided to stop some of its AI facial recognition because they're worried about bias. They are going to stop selling AI facial analysis software that infers a subject's emotional state, gender, age, and mood because they're worried that they're just not getting it right. And I think this is smart. Every time I look at some company that's like, we're going to use AI facial recognition software to figure out how you're feeling, I'm like, nope, don't do it. Don't do it.
No, you're not. Yes, you tried that with, it wasn't facial recognition. It was, I think,
Oh,
your
yeah.
voice.
God, Amazon with the Amazon Halo. And it kept telling me I was being aggressive.
That was it.
In cases where I was just being matter of fact. Hey.
Well, to be honest, no, I'm just kidding. No, you and I had a conversation, and the Halo was tracking your voice, and then it decided to say that Stacy was being aggressive. And I'm like, no, I mean, I heard everything you said. Nope. It's a cost benefit thing to me. Like the benefits of this aren't worth the cost of getting it wrong, being offensive with it, what it determines as your mood or feelings or whatever. I just don't see the benefit of doing this. I think that's what Microsoft is probably thinking as well here.
Yes. And they are still going to use AI to make guesses about some of people's feelings and emotional state, like via sentiment analysis on like customer engagement. So that might be like chatbot software looking for angry words, things like that. But they're not doing it with facial recognition.
I thought you said angry birds for a second there, but yes.
Angry words.
And there are ways to do this. I mean, I don't know if anybody uses Grammarly, which is a plugin to check your grammar and
I do.
Sentences. Yeah, as do I for my writing. It's a Chrome plugin or a browser plugin. They have a sentiment analysis of what it is you've written. Will your audience or the reader be happy? Are you being pessimistic? And it's actually pretty good. And I don't mind it because it works well and I don't feel offended by anything. It's,
Yeah, my tone is always really friendly or informative. I'm just like.
I think it's both.
Yeah, I try.
Stacey's an informative friend.
I'm an informative friend. Probably a little too informative. So yes, and there's
that would be me.
Yeah, no, I think it's both of us. That's why we have a podcast, Kevin.
That's right.
Kevin and Stacey inform you about the world of IoT. Speaking of the world of IoT, this is specific to the smart home, but Phillips Hue, they have some new products, as they often do. They release them all the time. But they have a new tap dial switch. And I'm kind of excited about that simply because I have like an ancient tap, which it charged itself. Mine still works. I've never changed the battery. Every time you tapped it, it would turn on lights or it had a couple buttons and I could turn things on.
Does it use kinetic energy of the button press to capture
It's
energy?
a piezo. Okay. They've now announced the Hue Tap Dial Switch, and you can turn the dial to brighten or dim your lights, and then you have buttons that can control scenes, and you can also take it off the wall. It's got basically, this is the tap combined with, they had a smart button a while back that was pretty nifty. I love mine. This is pretty cool. I'll probably get one. It's $49. And then they also announced track lighting, which, Kevin, you're apparently excited about.
Yes, the 80s are back with the Phillips Hue Peripheral track lighting. Is that how you would say it? Peripheral?
I would go with Peripheral, but...
Peripheral?
We're like,
we don't know. I don't know why they choose these names. I'm sure it has meaning to somebody. But yeah, so it's rails of track lighting. You can pick the layout and the length of the track and what lights to include.
Yeah, you've got spots and you've got lines, and it's kind of neat.
Yeah. I grew up on track lighting and I never moved the lights across the track, but my dad said, but you always could have. So I guess there's that.
Yeah, well, Hue is all about color ambiance, right? Like they want your walls to be. So I can see if you stick in this track lighting and you stick a couple light bars in there, then you've got some spots. You could have the light bars put color on your walls that might make you happy. And then the spots could actually provide lighting. I get it. It's fancy.
I mean, if you really wanted to go smart with track lighting, though, you should be able to control where the lights are on the track, have a little mechanism that rolls them around for different scenes and things.
How do you know there aren't little servos that do this? Although then you'd have to have 2 tracks because you'd have to move them beyond the other track. That would be complicated.
Well, I still like the idea.
Yeah, okay. I'm like sitting here going, wait a second.
Yeah, sure. They also have a portable table lamp, which is cute, not too big. $160 though, which is a bit much, although it can last for up to 48 hours without needing a recharge. So that's pretty nice.
I mean, it looks like a little mini floor lamp. I was like,
Yes.
I would take this camping in all honesty.
Oh, yeah.
But the Go lamp is not going to be available till summer, and your tap is available now. And the Peripheral,
And the track lighting.
and the track lighting will be available at the end of the summer.
Yeah. Interesting. They say that Hugo, oh, that's a terrible name. Hugo, not on a person, but for a product. The Hugo portable table lamp is indoor-outdoor. So I wonder if there's some kind of water resistance and such.
Oh, yeah. I would hope so. I've had a Hue.
I would hope so too.
I had the Hugo that looked like a bowl, and I enjoyed that. And that was outdoor capable. So I assume any of the Goes are.
I hope so. If they're calling indoor-outdoor.
Yeah, I mean, would I submerge it?
That's like saying a flashlight is indoor-outdoor.
I don't know if I want to spend $160 to find out, but it would be good for camping.
This is true.
Okay, let's talk about some news bits. Exciting news bits. We have, a new encoding to power wearables. Tell us about it, Kevin.
I will tell you what I can tell you about it because I read this ginormous long white paper that was in the American Chemical Society Applied Materials and Interfaces journal. Researchers from KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm have created this blend of thermoelectric coating for ink and what it's supposed to do. And they really focus more on the material side of it. But what my eye was, it can take heat from a running device and regenerate that heat or rehash it into more usable energy. So typically you have a battery powered device or a plug-in device would generate heat too, but you wouldn't use this. A battery powered device will heat up as the battery is used. You could recapture some of that energy to get longer battery life in, say, a wearable, a sensor, etc.
Yay! Always exciting. Hopefully we'll see this, I don't know, probably 10 years, but sure. And in other news, Google has said, hey, we're going to update our Nest Hub Max to be Matter compliant, and the world cheered. But they also said that it's going to break your Nest by Yale lock integration. Kevin, you used to have one of those. Boo.
I did. I don't think this is as big a deal as it sounds. Yes, it is a big deal for the people who are affected, but I don't think tons of people are affected. So when you buy a Nest by Yale lock, it comes with a little plug-in adapter that converts the wireless signals from the lock into Wi-Fi, basically. So that way you can control your lock and get information and so on. I'd say there's probably a limited range on that. So people were using the Google Nest Hub Max as an extender because it could do the same thing. So if you're using your Google Nest Hub Max as an extender for that Nest by Yale lock, that's not going to work anymore. You'll have to have your lock close enough to the included dongle, or Google is actually going to offer you a dongle as a result of this change for free. You'll get a coupon if you go and tell them, and complain. Again, this is not like tens of millions of people, but I can understand why people were upset.
Yes. I mean, anytime anything breaks, it makes sense.
Oh, yeah. But Google, I think, is doing right by people here. They don't have to send those free dongles out to further extend things.
That is true. Oh, and speaking of things that break, we didn't mention this in the rundown, but I should tell you that if you own a Smart Dry product, you probably have gotten the email. And Smart Dry is something that launched in, I think, 2019. And we talked a lot about it on the show because I thought it was just such a nifty little device. For $50, you got this little bridge, I guess, dongle bridge that you plugged in somewhere near your dryer, and it had Bluetooth to Wi-Fi. And then you had a sensor that you stuck via magnet inside your dryer. And it basically told you when your clothes were dry. Not when your dryer stopped, but actually when the clothes inside were dry. Mm-hmm. And based on that information, maybe you didn't run your dryer as long. Maybe you ran it longer. I don't know. And it told you actually when things got too hot as well. So, if you were doing a bunch of cotton stuff, maybe you want to keep the temperature lower. It was a great device. I recommended it to lots of people. I recommended it on the show. Unfortunately, the company that made it, it was a small 3-person company. They were just trying this out. And they're not going to be able to support it anymore. So they stopped support. They sent out an email last week saying, hey, we're not going to support it anymore. We've managed to pay our cloud costs through September, through the end of September. So that is how long you have for this thing to work with the app. Because I recommended this to all of you, I wanted to give you the update there. I think they did what they could. It's hard.
I mean, there's no subscription to use that. They had to maintain cloud costs. And yeah, that's tough.
Yeah, they were hoping that the energy companies would help subsidize things like this because it might reduce energy usage in the home. I don't think that got very far off the ground. I don't think they sold enough to create a sustainable business. So that's where that is.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in final bits of news, I just wanted to mention this. I threw this in the newsletter last week, but it's worth another mention because it's kind of a big deal. Nxp Semiconductors, they've actually released a new line, a whole new portfolio of microcontrollers. So these are the smaller MCUs that are all over the Internet of Things. And this whole family is going to be called the MCX family. And they've got 4 different branches of this family. One is going to be super fancy, very high performance for AI stuff, like in gateways and that sort of thing. There's going to be a wireless one. There's going to be a basic one that is like a budget version. And then there is going to be the like lowest power version possible. And I bring this up because we're seeing a lot more attention to MCU families and their capabilities, which I think is really important. And we're seeing a lot of variation there beyond just like 32-bit and a little bit of differentiation on performance. So if you're already using the Kinetis or other NXP line of microcontrollers, those are still sticking around. Okay, that concludes this segment of the show. But now let's go to the Internet of Things podcast hotline. This is the segment of the show where we hear from y'all and you ask us your questions. Y'all, I don't know if it's summer and y'all are just not excited about winning what is it they're winning? A hose? I don't know what to call
controller.
These. A water controller. Call us at 512-623-7424. Enter to win. Or just, ask us your question and maybe we'll answer it on the show. And you'll still be entered to win. So you have a really good chance of winning right now because we don't have a lot of callers so far for the month of June. But we did get enough to populate the show. So let's hear this week's caller, Greg, who has a question about presence sensors.
My name is Greg, and I've got a HomeKit home setup, and I've been looking for a good occupancy sensor that I can use in HomeKit. You all had mentioned that the new Ecobee Thermostat has a good occupancy sensor built in, but that's just one place in my home where the thermostat would be. I would like to know how and what types of devices I could use for occupancy sensors throughout the rest of the house that is more than just motion sensor. I want a true occupancy sensor. Any ideas for me? Thanks.
So I know Greg mentions the Ecobee thermostat. I had just reviewed it, and specifically it was the Ecobee Smart Thermostat Premium, because that has like basically radar detection that I can't fool. It's really good for presence. But Greg raises a good point because the remote sensors are not the same technology. They're still, I assume, passive IR sensors. So you do get occupancy, you do get presence via motion detection, but it's not as good.
Yeah, well, a PIR sensor isn't as sensitive. It's basically just detecting motion. If you tune your algorithms right, if you go with radar or ultra wideband or some of these newer sensing technologies, you can get the ability to detect like the shape of something. You can detect things like with radar, you can even detect things like breathing rates almost instantaneously and from far away, which means no longer do you need to have a person moving broadly to trigger these. They're just more sensitive. And we actually are just getting, I think not this year and maybe not next year. I think we're seeing the chipsets come out that enable these sensors. And that means they're going to be cheaper and better integrated. So over time, in like I would say 2024, you'll actually be able to buy more sensors at a reasonable price that will have some of these technologies. So I actually just wrote about 2 new sensors coming out that do proximity. One is from Novelda, and that's a Uwb Proximity Sensor. And then I also, TDK InvenSense, which is one of the world's largest sensor makers, just launched a sensor that uses ultrasonic technology. It's actually ultrasonic time of flight to figure out if a person is approaching a device or not. And a lot of these today aren't used for straight up motion. They're used actually as a way to wake up a smarter, more powerful sensor. But you could see them for things like motion or presence in the not too distant future. And by not too distant, I mean like 2024.
Yeah, it's just too early for the type of precision that Greg and other people might be looking for. I mean, that's a disappointing answer, but that's the reality of it. It's like we see it in a product, but like the Ecobee, yeah, it works really, really well. But that device sits in one place, and it's not like you're going to put 6 thermostats in your house just to see who's where. So we need to see more of these chips. We need to see more devices that, are purpose built for this.
Yeah. We'll get there eventually, but probably not in time for you to buy like more awesome sensors today. Sorry about that, Greg. All right. That concludes that segment of the show. Please, if you have a question, give us a call at 512-623-7424 and ask us your question. We would love to disappoint you with news that your product that you want is not available. Just kidding. We do not get enjoyment out of that. We are just as eager for advancements as y'all are. All right, that concludes that segment of the show. Please stay tuned for our guest, Daniel DeSantos, who is head of security research at Vedir Labs. And we're going to be talking about those 56 OT vulnerabilities. And he's got some surprising stats about how often industrial companies patch their OT equipment, what we can do to make that a little bit more robust, and more information for y'all. So stay tuned for that. But first, a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Nordic Semiconductor. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick break from the Internet of Things podcast for a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Nordic Semiconductor, and today we're going to have a chat with Par Åkesson, who is a product manager at Nordic Semiconductor. Hello, Par. First, can you tell me, please, a little bit about Nordic?
Nordic Semiconductor specializes in wireless technology that powers the IoT. We were established in 1983, and our award-winning Bluetooth low energy solutions have made us a global market leader. We are also an emerging leader in cellular IoT and building out a Wi-Fi product offering. Our high-performance, easy-to-design-in solution are used by world-leading brands within smart home, healthcare, asset tracking, gaming, sports, and more.
Excellent. So I know you're working with Thread. So let's talk about Matter. What is Nordic's role in the Matter ecosystem?
Yeah, first of all, Matter aims to create a unified communication standard across smart home devices. And Nordic plays an active role in developing that standard. Secondly, Nordic provides SoCs, which are microcontrollers with an integrated radio on an IC. Those ICs support the radio protocols needed by Matter. That is Bluetooth Low Energy and Thread. Nordic basically enables its customer and developers out there to easily integrate Matter into the product by supplying an easy-to-use software development kit and development kits and everything you need to develop a Matter product.
Okay, so if I were to design a product that will support Matter, how would I get started?
I would recommend to, as a first step, go to nordicsemi.com/matter. Here you will find quite some resources, for example, 2 webinars about Matter and how to develop products for Matter using our devices and tools. The next step is to get a development kit from us and download the SDK from our webpage and get started. Your choice for a development kit obviously depends on your application, but I would recommend you to check out our NRF 5340DK. That's our flagship SoC, and it's all there on nordicsemi.com/matter.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and today's guest is Daniel DeSantos, who is head of security research at Vedir Labs, which is part of Forescout. Hi, Daniel. How are you doing today?
Hey, Stacy, I'm doing great. Happy to have this conversation with you about OT security and all things insecure in OT.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot. So you're on this particular week because this week y'all discovered 56 vulnerabilities that are in OT gear. It's all under the name OT Icefall. And this is going to affect companies from Emerson, Honeywell, Omron, a bunch. And so why don't you talk to us about discovering these vulnerabilities and how worried we should be about them?
These vulnerabilities are related to what we call insecure by design in OT, right? Which is basically a somewhat known fact that OT devices lack basic security controls, such as authentication for protocols or encryption in many cases for protocols, or verification of firmware that is being downloaded to the devices, whether they have been signed by the actual manufacturer or they have been, passed some sort of integrity check or something like that, or have been tampered along the way, right? So we have been looking at OT devices at Federated Labs and at Forescout for a very long time, and we knew about some of these issues. Others we have found recently, but historically, many of those were not considered CVE worthy. Let's say, right? They're not real vulnerabilities in a way because OT is insecure and that's it, right? And people brush it off the fact saying OT is insecure. Forget about that. We kind of started noticing a shift in the community a while ago, a couple of years ago, where some of these type of vulnerability started getting CVE numbers. And we thought, okay, well, that's a good sign. Let's put together the things that we know, the things that we have been finding, and let's do a large disclosure and kind of an analysis of the vulnerabilities as well, not just publishing the CVEs, but what they actually mean, right? So we contacted CISA, we did a disclosure with the vendors and so on. That's why we ended up with this large bunch of 56. And we started looking at why they matter, right?
So for all of us who aren't security nerds, what is a CVE? And then let's talk more about why these vulnerabilities in OT matter.
Yeah. So a CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. And it's basically a system that was developed originally by MITRE to give specific IDs to specific software defects or problems that are known as vulnerabilities, right? A vulnerability is something that an attacker can exploit to gain access to a device or to subvert a device to take control of it. And a CVE is just an ID. It's usually CVE, the year it was disclosed, and a sequential number that is assigned by a CVE numbering authority. That means, there is a document, there is in a database somewhere saying this CVE affects this product and has this type of impact. And that is important because it serves as a document, right? Saying that these devices are vulnerable in this specific way. And that's why I think it's important nowadays, because in the past, as I said, there was not much care for security in OT, right? If you go back 20, 30 years ago, when people really didn't realize that those devices would be connected, sometimes even to the internet, or if not to the internet, at least to larger networks. And then you fast forward a little bit, maybe 10, 15 years ago, and there was this notion that they are starting to get connected, but still the prevailing thought was, okay, OT is insecure. We don't need CVEs. We just need to build fences around it, and OT is insecure. Forget about it. I think that now there is really a shift towards thinking that not just the network has to be secure, the devices should be secure also at some point, right? So we need to have those CVEs documenting the insecurity so that vendors can provide the patches, asset owners can apply those patches, CISA can push for people to patch things and so on, like they do nowadays in IT environments, right?
And I think it's important to note that, historically, you're right. OT equipment was not connected to the internet. You had to physically go in and plug in like some sort of device to attack it if there was a reason to do it. And then we started connecting it. We started getting firewalls that felt good. We had the Purdue model of security with like a DMZ in there. And I think now we're all aware that like nothing is truly air-gapped, but it still feels like the vendors are waking up and they're becoming more active about patching these things. I don't see the customers being as active about applying those patches. And I'd love for you to talk about why there's no such thing as like Patch Tuesday in a manufacturing environment.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. So actually, during the disclosure, we spoke with one of the vendors that mentioned that the patch rate that they had for OT devices, or when they put out a patch and how many people actually, or how many devices in the wild actually applied that, was around 10%. And it's not about that one specific vendor, right? They were basically saying that's an industry issue. It's the way it is. I think there is a reason for that is, a real reason, right? Not an excuse, in the sense that OT devices, if they require to be taken offline for a patch to be applied, that means stopping a physical process, which oftentimes cannot be stopped for years or at least for months in between maintenance windows. And that's one thing. But there is also, I think, a cultural difference there, right? Like OT operators don't have the Patch Tuesday, and they often historically maybe didn't pay too much attention towards, patching devices and securing them and what that means. I think that as IT-OT convergence happens and a lot of the responsibility towards securing OT also goes to CISOs and people who are more aligned with the IT management processes for patches and for security, there will be an increased rate, hopefully, in this 10%, right? But I think we are still far from the 100%, and we'll still be far for a while. So I think it's these two issues: the actual impact that it has on OT devices and the cultural understanding, let's say, around this.
You mentioned that some of these flaws are insecure by design, which I take to mean is there's not a lot you can do to fix it. Is that accurate? Are there things that, like, a patch will help? Are there things that should just be eliminated?
Yeah, in some cases there are like configuration changes, right? Like maybe it's a type of feature that is insecure, but you're not using that in your environment. It's a specific protocol in a device, or maybe it's a hard-coded credential that in some cases can be changed for a new one, right? Or maybe it's a function. For instance, there are firmware downloads in some cases that only happen when a PLC has a specific key switch on a specific mode, right? Let's say program instead of run. And basically there is a hardware way to secure that device. So in some cases, it's a configuration issue. In some other cases, it's a bit deeper, right? And it's protocols that are, for instance, not authenticated, and they are the basic engineering protocol. In that case, that is very, very complicated to change, and that often requires that you change the whole system, right? That is running. And that's why it would be very difficult for asset owners in this specific case to have these changes, right? And even for vendors to recommend, change your whole control system to a new product line that uses a new protocol version. Like, we know that at some point that has to happen, right? In the future, when things are naturally replaced because they get deprecated or whatever. But doing that before the end of useful life of a device because of a security issue is still not, I would say, the norm in OT.
Should it be the norm? And if so, how should we fund it? How should companies think about this? It's a trade-off between security and continuing your operations with a known entity, not having downtime, et cetera, et cetera. It's a big deal. So how should companies try to make this decision?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think it all starts with a risk management decision in a way, right? So the first step is definitely to identify what is on your network as an organization and truly what is there, right? Not just based on some Excel sheet that you think, I have a few devices here and there, but what is actually on the network and what software versions are running and what devices are communicating with other devices and so on and so on. And then based on that, you need to do a real risk assessment, which includes, business functions. What is the impact if a device is taken down and so on, right? Or taken down for patching, or taken down as part of an attack, or taken control over by an attacker. And then based on this risk calculus, this risk assessment, you can define what are the set of mitigation controls that you will put in place, right? Whether that is, as I said, changing the configuration or enforcing the network around segmentation or firewalls or things like that you mentioned in the beginning, or you need to replace it, right? And then when you get to the point where you need to actually replace something, there is a very difficult conversation indeed to have, right? Or either you live with the risk of having that attack, or you change completely a process or some devices in the process and so on. And I think that you touched a very good point there, which is about the funding, right? In the end, this is a business decision of whether I will stop producing things. Let's think of a manufacturing or I don't know, like a gas pipeline, right? You have to stop the gas flowing in the pipeline for a while so that you can replace things. If there is no redundancy, that means, completely stopping the process and not serving your customers. That would not fly as a business decision, right? Like completely stopping things for replacement. So I think that, the alternatives really are the network security part, identifying, as I said, mitigating in terms of segmentation and having detection and response for those things, right? So have incident response for attacks, which actually starts at the detection level, right? You need to monitor your network well to be able to detect when an attack happens, and then what you can do in terms of response. I don't think we will see the day when a whole process will be stopped and changed because the devices were insecure. Just it's a very difficult business decision in this case, right? It's a very, very difficult business decision.
Yeah, well, I think of things like, for example, Huawei equipment in small wireless ISPs or small local ISPs. The government actually was like, you know what, get it out of there. And they funded it. They both created a mandate and then funded it. I don't think we're there yet, but if I think it like critical infrastructure at like municipal water plants or even oil and gas refinery, it is critical infrastructure. So we may get to that point. I don't know. A little less doomsday-ish, I guess, to think about is this idea of adaptive security. So we really kind of talked about black and whites here and getting into some of the gray areas, but with the federal government getting more involved in IT and OT security, we're hearing more about like how to build programs, like you said, that monitor and detect things and then notify, and you can set policies around it. But talk about how companies should be thinking about their OT security, because it is different in today's environment.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And you mentioned adaptive security. And it's not only about, having a security architecture or process in place and then forgetting about it and then revisiting it in 5 or 10 years, right? The threat landscape is really changing every day and all the time nowadays. And that's another part of what we do at Federated Labs, what we do as researchers, which is not just disclosing vulnerabilities, but also looking at, what people use to attack real systems and what are the threat actors out there, what they're doing, what's their motivation, and so on, right? So I think that goes right to the heart of what this notion for adaptive security or for changing your controls, let's say, or for detecting things that are happening and then reacting to those really means, right? So I think that using threat intelligence effectively, having indicators of compromise, but also strategic threat intelligence in the sense of what are attackers looking for nowadays, right? And if you think about in a lot of cases, like for instance, if we're talking about manufacturing plants, right, that have a lot of OT equipment, they do have a lot of OT equipment and it's at risk and so on. But one of the big risks that they have nowadays is ransomware that starts on the IT side, right? So definitely, look at your IT side, make sure that is secure, and then look at the interconnection between IT and OT so that the threat actor cannot cross the line between the IT and the OT world and cause some havoc on your OT network, right? So I think that using effectively threat intelligence, not just indicators of compromise, but looking really at what attackers are after, what's their motivation, what's the type of attack that they are having, what are the common TTPs and so on, will have a major role in defining security programs, or should have a major role in defining the security programs. And if we're talking, just connecting back to our research to secure by design and so on, that is historically what OT attackers have exploited, right? Because there is often no need. We did a lot of research in the past about memory corruption vulnerabilities and software flaws that are exploited in OT that can be exploited in OT devices. And those are very interesting, but they are not what typically the attackers are exploiting in OT. Attackers are exploiting the fact that there's no authentication of the protocol. So you don't need a very complicated exploit, right? You just interact with the device directly and you have the full control in some cases. So what that means is using that intelligence, you can change your controls around that, right? So make sure that then the attacker cannot reach that point so that you don't have to worry about complicated exploits and things like that.
You mentioned that a vendor told you that only 10% of their customers actually implement the patch, which, I knew it was bad, but that feels really bad. So what can vendors do to help their customers feel comfortable patching or convince them? Are there things that should be done to help make this less arduous?
Well, the first thing is that vendors have to assign CVEs and actually, really publish the vulnerabilities and say what's going on, right? And not just have sometimes lengthy mitigations discussions without having the actual problem well documented, what that is and so on. Because then, as I mentioned, the asset owners, the actual users of the device, can take a good decision by themselves, right? Because that enters a risk management calculation, as I said, that is part of a larger security program. And then that makes things a bit easier, makes the conversation easier. So that's the first step, right? Recognizing these issues with CVEs, with CVSS scores, and with actual mitigation policies. Making the users or the asset owners feel more comfortable with patching, I think, goes around, the documentation that the vendors will provide and how effective that is in actually mitigating a problem, right? On the other hand, I think it's interesting that you mentioned before also that there are federal agencies involved in things and sometimes even funding action-specific programs to replace devices and things like that. I think that would be very interesting to see in the OT world, right? What would be the effect and the influence that a mandate, let's say, to change some devices, to remove insecure devices, to patch them immediately. I mentioned in the beginning that CISA now has the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, where agencies, federal agencies, have to actually patch those vulnerabilities within a certain time frame, right? And that those are still mostly IT, and there are some IoT vulnerabilities as well. Having something like that for OT would be very interesting. Of course, then you're talking about the public and private relationship there, because many of the asset owners are in the private sector. So those are all important discussions to have, definitely. But I think that there is a role for the vendors, as you mentioned. There is a role for regulatory agencies or other governmental bodies, and there is a role for the asset owners themselves to take some action.
Got it. All right. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the show and helping us out with this today.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It was a very fun conversation, and I hope to be back in the future and talk more about IoT, OT security, and all those fun things.
And that concludes this week's episode of the Internet of Things podcast. Please join us next Thursday, and don't forget to subscribe. And if you can't get enough IoT news, I would love for you to sign up at www.stacyoniot.com for our weekly IoT newsletter, where we explain all kinds of things that we don't even get to on the show. Once again, thank you for listening, and please subscribe.